Good morning, everybody, on this wonderful Tuesday, our very last staff session of 2023, if you can believe it. And probably one of our most popular sessions to date. I'm going to hand over to Pete, and we'll get the session started. Thank you, Rosie. Yeah, any questions in there, and hopefully we'll pop anything in, but as always, please feel free to pop anything in the chat as we go. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you. So nice to be with you this morning. I've got a quick presentation to go through with you, and I'm not going to rush it, but I'm not going to dwell, because I think it's much more important that you get time with Bethany, Shaunna and Laura, who are our experts by experience. Bethany and Shaunna are doing PhDs at the moment. Laura is a graduate who also delivers mentoring and support to neurodiverse students. So I think we're going to have some really good perspectives from each of them. Okay, I'm going to talk about what are the potential impacts on students with neurodiverse profiles in terms of their student financial well-being. And I need to make very clear, if you've met one person with a neurodiverse profile, you've met one person with a neurodiverse profile. So I'm talking in very general terms. This doesn't apply to everyone, but there will be some elements of it probably that are relevant. I've worked with lots of different universities in my time as an employee and also as a consultant, and recent projects to do with neurodiverse as a theme. With the Wellcome Trust, you may have seen our research with Disabled Students UK about the lived experience of students in the life sciences with disabilities, including students with neurodiversity. Done a project with the Neurodiverse Staff Network at the University of Bristol, for example, and with the Imperial War Museum. It was about children and families with neurodiverse profiles visiting. So quite a broad experience. Just noting that this is quite an overwhelming diagram. I think it's a really good one, but if you are suddenly experiencing a bit of fear and anxiety and oh my god, what am I looking at, then that might be an experiential experience, and that might be what some neurodiverse people experience when provided with information. I'm not going to expect you to read and digest all this, and you are going to get the slides, but the point I want to make in this is that having a neurodiverse profile has many positive attributes and aspects. Element to neurodiverse profiles. So Discalculia, which we will obviously touch on today because we're talking about money and we're talking about numbers, does have an overlap in terms of impact with dyslexia, or people with autism may also experience dyscalculic elements, and people with ADHD, etc., etc. So the point being that there's a lot of interplay between these diagrams. I've used this with permission from Professor Amanda Kirby, who is an excellent source of expertise when it comes to neurodiversity. Two bits of legislation that need to keep in mind: the Equality Act, which has been with us since 2010, and in most cases, neurodiversity is likely to be considered a disability under the Act. And there's a much more recent piece of legislation called the Consumer Duty, which came out in 2023, I think goes live properly in 2024. Or I may be wrong about that, because there's quite a lot of legislation I've been working on recently which came out in 23 and has effect in 24. But when it is fully in place, it should protect certain types of customers, such as people with low incomes or in vulnerable circumstances, who aren't getting the value they should from the products and services in the financial space, perhaps because they're unable to benefit from important project features, or are more likely to pay charges because they've missed payments, or they've misunderstood payments, such as may impact on them. So those are two kind of things to be aware of. Just touching on maths anxiety, which is not necessarily a neurodiverse aspect, but may again be co-occurring. It's a very real condition, and the British Dyslexia Association describe it as not dissimilar to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And when people have had a traumatic experience around mathematics, they may go into fight or flight mode. It may impact students as young as 6. And it's a kind of the pattern of they're afraid to have a go because they're hesitant around maths. So they don't do it, they don't learn new skills, they don't have the skills then to build new learning, and they're afraid to have a go. So it's a kind of self-propelling or self-perpetuating challenge or difficulty. Many people have hesitancy around maths. This is a kind of very palpable anxiety, particularly in the area of numbers, and it has to come from someone who has there's no other good explanation for that difficulty in terms of terming it as maths anxiety. I've used the American Psychiatric Association definition of dyscalculia. Obviously, I'm using a medical term here, which is not the social model, but I think it's important to understand a kind of definition around this so that we've got a sense of what we're talking about, and then we can address those societal barriers. But it's a specific learning disorder, so that's why we know it's medical, because they call it a disorder rather than a difficulty. They use terms like impairments, but it's about processing numerical magnitude, so the size of it, performing accurate and fluent calculations, and they must be, to be at the level of dyscalculia, quantifiably below what is expected at their age level, and they can't be attributed to poor educational experience or intellectual impairments as part of the daily activity. So just a very medicalized term about dyscalculia. So let's just reinforce that if you have a dyscalculic difficulty, which impacts you in terms of estimation, arithmetic, shape and space, time and money, and maths facts, it's likely also to co-occur with things like handwriting, for example, or things like the reading ability or the ability to absorb or take in information. So we may have students who have difficulties with times tables, for example, and that may not just be a kind of manual brain thing. It may be, oh, well, you just use your phone like everyone else. Structural literacy is a particular term which I am impacted. For example, I'm an Android user and I use Microsoft products predominantly. The minute my wife passes me her iPhone and asks me to look something up, I'm completely lost. I can't function within an iPhone environment. And that means that my structural literacy is good for Android, but not for others. And the analogy being that you may be completely competent with a piece of technology, but the minute that you need to use it for something outside of your comfort zone, it may not function for you. When people are still taking money, there may be some difficulty in working out the change in a shop or mix up symbols such as a plus or an X. And when they're being asked to convert pounds, they may think of pounds money-wise, as then their brain may take them to converting to kilograms because pounds, kilos, etc. So it's that kind of flurry of activity. Be really uncertain in terms such as interest in percentages and challenges with estimating. In the Financial Times this weekend, there was quite a timely article for me, knowing that I was doing this Tuesday morning and read this on Sunday afternoon. There's the kind of, I've heard of a disability tax and other sort of taxes, but the ADHD tax, which refers to money lost from financial mistakes, forgotten bill payments, ill-considered spending, those kind of things. But in the survey that was in the referred to from YouGov last year that Monzo Bank undertook, 60% of the respondents living with ADHD estimated they'd lost about £1,600, and the ADHD impacted on their ability to manage money. And other challenges like low executive function, so that was organizational time management skills, that dopamine seeking brain, so much more interested in doing other things that increase dopamine levels rather than doing the kind of financial management or filling in those forms or checking balances, etc. And then the other neurodiverse aspect, which might be a slower speed of thought, and then procrastination, might not keep paperwork in a logical place, or whether that's digital or in paper, and that hesitancy to even open bank statements or apps. And that leads to the feelings of embarrassment, feeling the difficulty, and that frustration. I'm not going to dwell on that because I think we can probably all imagine or will have probably seen or experienced that palpable. So what can we do to help on a very top level way? I mean, we're going to hear some great insights and about, the kind of real impacts, but also what may have worked well. But readability, So whether it's in paper or digital, but there is a WCAG, which is the World Wide Web Accessibility Standards, WCAG, that includes a level of readability expectation. And most of your activity, I'm sure, will be digital, but there is a real readability expectation in there. There are tools that you can use to check the readability levels. If you're not providing a glossary of terms, do so. If you're not providing advice at all stages, and that might be a visual video, how to do this process, or here are some frequently asked questions in a video or audio format rather than just a written one, and give people a WAGOL, which is what a good one looks like, WAGOLL. What's a good one? What's a good example of what they need to do? I think essentially, though, in all walks of life and in everything we do, we need to be patient, we need to be understanding, and we need to be kind. Easy to say, not so easy to do. Not going to dwell on this other than if you look at this example in front of you, lots of written text, which is immediately replicated in a much more simple format from this guidance on how to communicate more effectively with people with lived experience of dyslexia, a similar one on autism, and how we can communicate much better in this format. And that's me for the quick presentation, setting the scene. Hopefully that gives you what you need in terms of a baseline level of understanding. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen now so that I can see you all, and also so that I can see panel members. Okay, so what we're going to do now is essentially have an active conversation with the participants. We've got some pre-questions that have come in, which we're also going to manage. But first of all, I'm going to start with Bethany. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this morning. If you just want to give us a quick introduction of who you are, what you do at John Moores, that would be great.
Yeah, so my name is Bethany Donaghy. I am a PhD candidate at Liverpool John Moores University. I'm in my final year now of my PhD. I am autistic, and I also have an array of co-occurring diagnoses. I think a prevalent one for the conversation around neurodivergence would be that of OCD as well. I received my autism diagnosis in the final year of my undergraduate, which I also did at John Moores University, and I received that about 2 weeks before my final year exams, which was a fun time.
Great, yeah, wonderful timing, and I'm sure that helped your progress out. But it's a testament that you're here, you're doing well, you're still on track on your PhD. So congratulations for that.
Thank you.
Do you just want to give us a quick insight into what your experience was like at university in terms of how your neurodiverse profile influenced that?
So my experience is quite a weird one in the context of half of my university experience, I was an undiagnosed neurodivergent person versus the second half where I was a diagnosed neurodivergent person. Prior to my original undergraduate in psychology, which I completed, I actually dropped out of a different undergraduate course, which is something that's not really spoken about quite a lot, but is a very common thing for neurodivergent students, specifically autistic students. So I always had a plan of what I wanted to do. From the age of 7, I wanted to go to university to become a dentist. Clearly that didn't happen because I am not looking at people's teeth at the moment. So when I didn't get the grades in my A levels, it was a kind of ip dip do. What am I good at? I'll do chemistry. And that was very much so. I can see now as an autistic person that I had my structure and plan. And when that didn't happen, I kind of went into disarray and just chose something at random. And when that didn't work out, I dropped out because I hated it, absolutely hated it. And then obviously went on to psychology, which I did complete. But I think that construct of need and structure has been a key element throughout my whole university experience. I really struggled if lecturers didn't give me clear instructions. They didn't tell me the ins and outs of an assignment. I needed to know the structure of the assignment to be able to effectively complete it. If I didn't know that, my anxiety would be absolutely through the roof. And it got to the point of needing this structure and clear instructions that I got to quite a bad place in terms of anxiety and depression, and my mum had to step in and get me support from the university. Looking back now, I received that again when I was undiagnosed, but a lot of the support I had in place from that moment is exactly the same support I have in place now as an autistic diagnosed person, which to me is interesting in the sense that one of the things I often discuss in terms of, struggling at university and accessing support is we could likely identify undiagnosed autistic people if we just looked at the support they have in place. Because a lot of the support I was accessing was what an autistic person needs. So it was that structure. The lecturers giving me the ins and outs of everything. I didn't need to put on discussion boards. That was the big thing around my anxiety and perfectionism. I didn't want to look stupid in front of people. So I was allowed to email lecturers directly, even if the same question was coming from 101 students, where typically they say, put it on the discussion board. I don't want to have the same question from everyone, understandably, but I was allowed to bypass that. And I also had a big thing around exams where, again, something prevalent throughout my whole life, if I wasn't getting an A or 100%, I would feel like a failure. So I had a lot of discussions around how I could have better support in place around this, like extra time so that I could understand the question, I could understand what was being asked of me to ease that anxiety. I had my own room so that I didn't feel extra pressure from everyone around me scribbling down and me thinking, oh my God, I've not done enough, I'm going to fail, I'm the worst person ever. And they were things that were really helpful, but even now there's still things around my diagnoses that are popping up that perhaps I didn't know in my undergraduate and masters. So a big thing for me is travel. And being a PhD student now, doing conferences, I travel quite a bit to different countries. And I am really bad with travel. Like it's not a very structured process. There's a lot of unknowns around like security. I struggle with timings, so I have to be everywhere early. So having a timing for a plane, say it's at 5 p.m, I feel I need to be at the airport 11 a.m. to make sure I'm there on time, which is absolutely drastic. But that's been something we've been trying to understand and process with my supervisor on how I can be better support through that. I think it's just a constant learning journey from undergraduate to masters to PhD of the different things that are going to pop up that you need to understand and need support with.
And in terms of that's really helpful outlining, what you've benefited from and what that's given you, but we're still on a journey in terms of, it's never entirely giving you a level playing field. Mm-hmm. In terms of reflecting on financials at university, and mm-hmm. you're still involved in that with the PhD funding, etc. What were the challenges that you experienced that you can kind of relate to your neurodiversity or other areas of your profile?
Yeah, so my kind of understanding with finances for me might be different from the kind of typical student profile. So at Liverpool John Moores University, we have a high proportion of students from Liverpool. I'm from Liverpool. I lived at home the whole time throughout my undergraduate and masters, and then moved out to my own house 5 minutes up the road from my mum and dad during my PhD. So I was lucky enough during my undergraduate and masters to live at home rent-free. But saying that, I still had financial struggles, which again is not something people expect when you don't have the pressure of paying rent and having to process that. But for me, and it's something interestingly that is actually in my diagnostic form, is that whereas a lot of students or just people in general, a balance of 0 is the point at which you have not got any money to spend. Whereas the way my brain works is because I'm constantly thinking, what if something goes wrong? I need to plan for this. What if something pops up? I need to know and constantly be one step ahead. A key feature was that unless I had £1,000 in my bank account, that was my 0. 1,000 was always my 0. So people could never process the fact that I had money there, but I felt like I had none. And it's confusing to even explain to people because it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense to me even why my brain works that way. But I just always need that amount there as a buffer in case something happens and something goes wrong. So on to make sure I always had that, even though I had, you know, like the bursary and all that sort of thing, I was always working as a receptionist alongside my degree to make sure I constantly had that money coming in, to make sure I was always at that balance. And it was stressful because I would speak to people who were actually struggling with money, and then I'd tell them, you know, well, I'm struggling with money, but I've got this amount, and it'd be like, you're not struggling. But it was that constant battle of, I'm anxious about this, but it's not in the same way as someone else is anxious. And then as an autistic person, trying to communicate and have that discussion about the emotions around it was very difficult. And again, it is a very privileged thing, I'm aware, to be able to have £1,000 in your bank, but to me, I always felt like I was at nothing. Yeah, and it's quite weird to discuss that.
Yeah, I imagine. There's a quick question that's come up in the chat, and I just ask you now if that's okay, because we've just got a minute left and then I'm going to move on to Shaunna. But the question is, how much of an impact did it have on you to have your diagnosis and understand why you felt and acted in certain ways? Did it remove some of the pressure you put on yourself?
So definitely yes. And one of the major things that my mum and I spoke about when going down the diagnostic journey, and I'm happy to discuss this more offline with whoever in terms of getting to that point of going through the diagnostic and what got us to that position. When I was struggling and feeling different, my mum often said that, you know, going through the process of getting diagnosed as autistic was going to provide explanations to help me process why I did things a certain way. So, for example, like I was saying then about needing that baseline of £1,000 and how that was zero to me, I was able to process that a bit better and understand what that meant for me.
Okay.
So it provided explanations that were really helpful and helped with the pressures.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, for some people it's a light bulb moment, and for some people it's a disappointment and a deflation, in my experience, because you know, it doesn't give you that insight. Thank you, Bethany. That's a great start. I really appreciate your candor and sharing that experience with us. It's much appreciated. And Shaunna, if we could kind of ask you a similar question in terms of, you know, what was your experience in neurodiverse, you know, as a neurodiverse student at university? Probably a bit different, probably a bit similar. What did that look like for you?
Yeah, so I'm a lived experience PhD student. So what that means is I researched the topic of care experience. So I grew up in the care system. So my experience is probably, again, a bit different to the average student, because only 6% of care experience people go to uni. So there's not high numbers of us. So obviously being estranged from my family brought barriers, as well as being neurodivergent and having co-occurrent like mental health issues as well. So it's a mixed bag, I like to put it. But yeah, I'm dyslexic, so I got diagnosed in my last year of college. And I got that really you know, not nice sentence said to me a lot, where it's like, you're too clever to be dyslexic, you can't be dyslexic. And I had all of these like issues where like I'd be like constantly late to things. I had the worst organization skills anybody could imagine. And I really, really struggled in classroom formats. Like, I just thought I hated school and education. No, I hated the way that like secondary and primary schools are set out to learn. And I found it like a really anxiety provoking situation. I always say, if someone gives me £1,000,000 to spend a day in high school, there's no way I'd take it. Like, it was like honestly the worst years of my life. And it was only like when I went to college, my history teacher, the first day I ever met her, she went, "Where's your learning plan?" I was like, "What do you mean?" And she's like, "You're dyslexic, aren't you?" And I was like, "No, I'm not." And then she was like, she sent me to have a diagnosis, and obviously they diagnosed me dyslexic straight away in college. But then when I was like going to head to uni, I had to go for another like sort of assessment, and that was through Broadbright and Co. And talking about like sort of financial difficulties, I grew up in Manchester, and this assessment place was on the other side of Manchester, so I had to get like a train and 2 buses. and it was ridiculous. And to literally go there for half an hour and to come back again, and that was like a real stressful period because being care experience, obviously I was living in my own council flat from the age of 16, and working at Subway to pay, and like I was on benefits. So to do even like that beginning process to the university was a real financial burden to me actually. But I'm really glad that I had it in place from the start of my undergrad. And that was really helpful to me. But I would say it came in many steps. So when I first started, one thing that they did put in place, which I didn't have in college, which would have been helpful, is like I had an individual learning plan. So what that meant was tutors were meant to give me the slides in advance. I could see the exam question in advance if I wanted to. I got like some allowances to print out lecture slides in green and have like green papers and overlays. But I honestly didn't really know how to utilize that. And often lecturers wouldn't give me the slides up front unless I asked for it. And I just always felt really uncomfortable to do that. So I never did. Which I thought like could have been really helpful. And then there was stuff like they offered me like a note taker, and I felt too anxious to walk into a massive lecture hall on the best of days, never mind bringing a member of staff with me. So I never took that up. And I sat my first year exams and had basically a mental breakdown in the exam and walked out. So I failed my first year exams. And from that moment onwards, they started to have conversation with me about doing alternate assessments. And that's what I did all the way throughout up to PhD. And honestly, I would not be sat doing a PhD without them. And what that meant was when like people went around to sit exams, I got given the exam paper and could sit it in my own home. And I would have like 5 days to complete it. And often what that meant was I wouldn't have to be in exam halls, but I would have to complete essentially 2 coursework questions within a week. So I was like from 9 till early hours of the morning every day of that 5 days writing it, and then I've complete and utter burnout at the end of the week. And then again, another layer of being care experience would mean that I'd have to not have that time to relax. I had to get up and go to work then. So I was constantly in these cycles of burnouts, I would say. But what I would think that was quite good about my uni is whenever I went to disability and was like, no, I actually could really do with this, they did the best to do it. But I think I'm just really poor at advocating for myself and knowing what I needed. And I've never actually had really in-depth conversations about how dyslexia impacts me, and the true understanding of that. And it's only through like having conversations with Beth and having conversations in these sort of things I've actually started to learn a bit more about myself and about like, whoa, this could help, and this is a part of my dyslexia, which I thought would have been really helpful. Um, and what that often meant is in my undergrad, especially, I feel like I've gotten better now. But in my undergrad, I really, really struggled with like budgeting and money. I've never had that sort of money before. I've always had been on like 0 hour contracts, like working like doing minimum wage. So to get my student loan in all at once, I was like, woo, I'm rich. And I obviously paid like my rent and my bills. And coming from a poor area as well that's full of poverty, like none of my friends had that understanding to guide me either. So I ended up spending a lot of money in my first term of uni and then having to rely a bit on smart pig loans, and then that ended up into a bit of a cycle. And I was really lucky in my master's. I managed to take up another job that paid me just above minimum wage, and that allowed me to somehow, before my PhD, to pay off my overdraft. But I maxed my overdraft out in my first term of uni. I was a smart pillow. It was not good. And I was able to tap in some of the support fund that the uni has. So like during my PhD, I applied this year and I got £1,000, which will cover the £500 write-up fees, which I'll need for an extension period, because what often it looks like a lot of dyslexia support cannot be transferred over appropriately to PhD level of studying. So like having extra times in exams, you know, having them alternate assessment, you can't have an alternate thesis, you can't have alternate viva. So a lot of the support, I feel like my PhD is where I felt actually the least supported with my neurodivergency, and that's no fault of the university, but it's the way that higher education is set up. Um, but I would say throughout my PhD, they've been really good with disability and mental health. I got my PTSD diagnosis this year after going through lots of misdiagnoses, and I have scoliosis. And they put taxis in place to and from uni every day, which has been really helpful because throughout my undergrad and masters, I was walking 5 miles a day and then being in chronic pain for the rest of the day, not studying the best. So that's been really, really helpful. And they got me like a stand-up desk in the uni, which I didn't have to pay for. And being care experience again, I was in emergency accommodation for 7 months of my PhD, and actually the university stored my disability desk and chair during that period of time, which was really good of them. So there's been a lot of positives and a lot of negatives, I would say.
Thank you, Shaunna. I didn't need to ask you to focus on the finances because you'd already done that for me, which not really surprising. Thank you for that. I'll bring you back in if there's questions coming up, but that's again a really good overview. Slightly different, as I kind of anticipated, but thanks for sharing all those particular challenges and giving a bit more of what you might describe an intersectional or a kind of approach where lots of aspects of your challenges kind of interacted. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Shaunna. Now I'm going to ask Laura to come in. So Laura has been a student with lived experience of neurodiversity, but from her perspective today, I'm looking for more about what broad general themes you see in the students that you work with and mentor and support. Bethany touched on kind of people dropping out or doing 4 years for a 3-year course with autism, which is actually quite commonplace. I think there was a study that showed it was about 70% of undergraduates with autism, often take a year longer to do the course, and other aspects of that. But what are your initial thoughts, Laura, and observations from the work that you do?
Yeah, so firstly, I'd say Bethany and Shaunna, those experiences that you've shared is what I experience day to day from students exactly like yourselves, varying different experiences. But the main thing that I tend to find when students come forward, especially when we first begin support, is that one, they're completely overwhelmed. They're usually at the very centre of trying to organise everything for themselves at university, making sure their reasonable adjustments are in place, making sure that their finances are in the right place. They're also trying to deal with their mental health problems, probably have a lot of personal things ongoing. But all of it, for the university system, the way that it works, it comes back to the student and puts them at the centre of responsibility to get all of those things in place, which quite often than not doesn't tend to work very well and just tends to be a very stressful experience and takes a lot of time. Now, when a person does have mentoring, so these are students who are accessing DSA, the mentor can be really beneficial at that point, whereby they can act as that advocate for the student and advise them, support them, build rapport with them, take away that responsibility and try to connect the dots with them, which just reduces that burden. But unfortunately, a lot of students who are at university who may or may not have a diagnosis and they may also not be accessing DSA support or don't have it funded, do not have access to specialist mentoring. They will have access to the wellbeing team at the university. There won't be one person who they can turn to for advice in all of these facets. So quite often than not, the student goes unsupported and the problems then, begin to tumble. So from a financial perspective, just from my experience, there's a few students off the top of my head that I'm thinking about. That can lead to things where I've had students who have taken a leave of absence. They've been off for a year because they've got themselves into a difficult financial situation. and they've had to take a year out in order to get a job to build back money. Some of these students as well are single parents. They have children to support. They are also find it very difficult to get childcare costs covered. Some universities have been beneficial in assisting with that, or some of them offer childcare support too. But again, it's all back on them to get that arranged, which I'm sure you can understand that's quite difficult. Additionally, what I tend to find is a lot of students with various different neurodiversities, they tend to do a lot extra compared to neurotypical students. So they'll be parts of societies, they'll be program reps, they'll probably have like 2 jobs ongoing. They might have lots of different friends, or they might be trying to make friends, but then struggling with getting time on their own. And all of that in itself is just, it just takes a lot of mental and physical energy. And then when things do go wrong, they haven't got the energy spare to then manage it and deal with it. And then it again, just crumbles, and there's no safety net there often to stop that student from falling through the cracks.
Is there anything that you've seen in particular that works well? You know, you work in lots of different universities, right? So, you know, Bethany's and Shaunna's experience is a bit Liverpool John Moore centric, although I know that they'll be aware of other universities. But from your perspective of looking across different universities, is there a sort of, not a silver bullet, but something that seems to be effective in those different settings or places?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the biggest green flags for me with universities is about communication. And I'm sure you guys have heard this time and time again, because I know when I was working for one university, this was a big thing with us too. One thing in particular which I've seen work quite well is when if we know that a student has neurodiversity or even some sort of mental health difficulty, is having a person that they can turn to who can be in cahoots with everybody else with them. So to take, for example, there's a couple of universities who have their disability advice team spread across different schools. So rather than the disability advice team sitting in one office where they're away from the academics, they miss those off-chance encounters to run into lecturers and academics face-to-face, for example, or other members of staff. But when they're part of a school, the lecturers get to know who they are. The disability advisor also knows how that program works, because usually each program is slightly different, and they've got more chance encounters to bump into each other. The students also knows that they've got one hub to go to access that sort of support or advice that they may need, so they know exactly where to find them. That has been quite beneficial. Again, it's not perfect. It definitely isn't. There's always different things that are helpful for other people, but that's one thing in particular that I've found. But I think the key takeaway there is, I don't think it's necessarily just about upping and moving your staff around. I think it's more just about having like a flagpole for a singular person that they can go to who is aware of everything going on. If that makes sense.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to give your voice a little bit of a rest, and bring back in Bethany and Shaunna, and you know, if people want to add additional questions into the chat, now is the time. But we've got a couple that came in advance of the session. So you've touched on a few things, both of you, about what practically universities might do to help reduce burdens for students with neurodiverse profiles. We've heard good communication is great. What other things, on reflection from your experience, or I know you're involved in student and other networks, what do you recognize as being a really good thing that probably most universities could adapt or adopt?
I think for me, one of the good things that I've recognised at the university currently is that the kind of neurodivergent boards are beginning to include students, so making sure student voices are heard as opposed to the people sat at the top, you know, giving their opinion on what students actually experience. I think it's so important that without and throughout everything we champion nothing about us without us, because with all due respect, the people at the top were probably students many years ago. The experiences have changed a lot. And if they are neurodivergent themselves, again, their experiences at university are probably very different to the students now. So I think having that inclusion is so key. And although this isn't per se such a practical thing, more so just something that needs to be considered. As an autistic person myself, when I do talks like these, every single time I come off these talks, I have someone come up to me and say, my cousin's more autistic than you, my son is autistic, but he's more autistic than you. It's this constant comparison of what being autistic means and what it looks like. And I think to be practical and inclusive of the things we do, we need to be more considerate that there is not one image of what autism is, or any neurodivergence for that matter. We need to be aware that, there are different experiences, and in being practical, we need to consider how we can adapt these things for each individual as opposed to blanketing it.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And Shaunna, what any kind of immediate thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think for me, so for context, me and Beth has both done our undergrad, masters, and now PhD at John Moores. And as I've spent more and more time there, you obviously get to know the member of staff more, and like where people sit and da. So as I've actually got to my PhD, I've actually been so much better at knowing where to go and like how to gain that support. So for me, what I'd really like to put in place is like almost like mentorship from the beginning of the beginning of your sort of university experience, because I think one thing that isn't talked about is like it is an experience that I've definitely felt, and I know other students have, is like you almost have to ask for that. But how, and then like this is what something I insanely struggle with. How am I going to ask for something that I don't know exists? It's like asking for an abstract thought. It doesn't make any sense to me to do that. So like I think like it's really helpful now that we have members of staff that would almost go like, oh, have you ever thought about this, Shaunna? But that's only by building a relationship and them knowing me as a whole person. They've known to ask for that. So I think mentorship could be really helpful. And like Beth said, having students sit on panels, so the way that information is carried out and advertised is really important. So yeah, and that's actually how I got my taxes in place, which obviously helped financially massively. Because I'm saving like a £5 a day. I know it sounds stupid, but it adds up. And that's because she knew I had scoliosis, and she was like, "Why is your plan's not in place?" And I was like, "What plan? What can you do for scoliosis?" Like, and then she like told me, so I could have had that support all along, and I only got it in my PhD.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. There's a question in there that's come up around. So you described a situation, Shaunna, that's quite common. You get a lump sum of cash, and some students with neurodiverse profiles may have an impulsion or may not be used to that kind of money, as you described. How would you kind of plan for that next time? What would be good in terms to avoid? I'm not saying you can avoid impulse decisions, but what would go better, do you think? What would your advice be to universities around that?
Well, I think it starts before university. So like, and I'm sure like this is maybe a bit more of an issue for care experience profiles or estrangement. But when I was applying for student finance, and like for context, I've paid bills from being 16. I've had a tenancy from being 16. I knew how to handle money to an extent. I've never defaulted a rent payment in my life. But I think I hate saying this, but I did think I had a bit of poor like financial literacy at the time. Like, even though I knew how to pay bills and all that sort of stuff, I didn't know what to do with the leftover. And like, so that's the thing. I've always paid my bills on time. I've always paid my rent on time. But then actually managing, this is how much you need for food. This is how much you need for transport. Was not conceptualized in my head. And the university do run like budget sessions. They do. So when you apply for the student support fund, you're forced to budget. and it tells you how much money you have left over, which became a big surprise to me in my PhD, I'm not gonna lie, because I still haven't contextualized how much money I got left over after paying bills 5, 6, 7 years later. But I think, somebody sitting down with me at that beginning week of uni and going, right, this is how much your rent's going to, and this is where you spend your money, and not frame it in this like budgeting sort of thing, but just frame it in like sort of like organic like mentorship, because no 18-year-old is going to sit there and budget and keep it well. So I think it needs to be done as almost like gentle parenting from the university and wider. And I think it will help a lot better, and it doesn't feel shameful or stigmatizing by doing it in that way.
Yeah, so normalizing essentially. And Bethany, I see you've got your hand up, and then I'm going to come to you, Laura, with a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to something that Shaunna said, which I think is really important about having them conversations about what to do with excess money. So for me, I'm very the opposite. I never paid a single bill until I was 23. And even now, my husband sorts all that because it's too much for me. I don't like looking at money. Again, I need that baseline that isn't zero to feel comfortable. But from quite a young age, I've had access to a financial advisor who's always informed of the best ways to kind of budget and having different accounts for different things. And something that isn't spoken about a lot is a lot of these financial advisors will speak to young people because they want them to make good financial decisions. So I think perhaps if universities could partner with certain aspects of financial advisors to teach about these different aspects of different accounts for different things, I think it might be very beneficial. And it just made me think on the basis of what Shaunna was saying about having that structure in place early and having that understanding from the get-go.
So over and above the platform like Blackbullion that, gives you lots of financial literacy, hints, tips, knowledge, that sort of thing, that individual input. Okay. Shaunna, I'm going to invite you back in very quickly and then...
Yeah, I was just going to say a very quick sentence to add on that. I think that was really important because I still don't have a savings account. It terrifies me to have more than one bank account. So I've had the one Santander account since I've been 16, and the idea of setting one up absolutely like sends me. So I think like having an advisor sitting down to me, like your money is not going to disappear, it's just in a separate account, would be really great.
Great, thank you. So Laura, there's a question about what mentoring would look like. So Bethany's described mentoring and getting that support, or Shaunna's described that kind of that kind of mentoring approach. But the kind of mentoring you do, is there a way that you can describe it so people can understand a bit better about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So for each individual, mentoring can look very different. And that is the point of mentoring. So it's specifically tailored to the individual and their needs. So take, for example, I'm going to use your experiences that you've shared, both Bethany and Shaunna, with regards to your money. So you've got two very different people here. You've got Bethany, who you sound quite structured in your approach to finances. And then Shaunna, you're fairly structured with your approach to paying your bills, but you're not too sure what to do with the excess afterwards. Just like everybody else in the world, we all have different sort of feelings towards like how we want to live our lives and how we want to manage things. So what a mentor does is we would sit with that individual, learn exactly, listen to them exactly what their issues are, what difficulties they have, what anxieties they have, whether it's around money or other things. And then we'd look at, right, what can we do about it? And it's very informal, and we build a lot of rapport. We're very much like a friend in a lot of ways as well. And it's sort of like that advice that you're looking for, Shaunna, where we might just be suggesting, actually, I mean, I've even done it myself. I'm thinking of one particular experience where I took a student to a supermarket to buy a kettle, because they didn't know how to buy a kettle or how much they should pay for a kettle. So they took me along to basically say, well, 60 quid for a kettle is quite a lot for a university student, so you probably want to get a 20 quid one. But the kettles, there's no difference between the kettles. They both boil water. But they needed somebody to go through that process with them, to just give it to them as a person would, rather than given an average as to what a kettle should cost. So I hope that sort of helps a little bit. Do you have any sort of further questions on that?
No, I don't think so. There's a couple to come in, but I mean, a lot of the mentoring, or most of the mentoring you do, is either funded by the university or funded by disabled students' allowances, and it's a way to remove those barriers to study. So you're not doing kind of psychological support or social services intervention, but you're working with a student to develop those skills that they need in a social context to be able to study effectively, essentially. Hopefully I'm not mischaracterizing you. There's a bit of chat around, yes, we don't have enough staff to do those one-to-one interactions, and we're meant to be enabling students to progress independently. Absolutely. We're not suggesting that you suddenly develop the most enhanced one-to-one support system ever, but it's more around, that they're just maybe those little one-to-one interactions that, you've systematized your processes, and you may have, drop-in hour or something, or some way of interacting with people. But there's a kind of neat little segue as well about budgeting workshops that offer guidance on some of the areas that we've covered, but they struggle to get students to engage with them. Is it because of anxiety around these topics, would you guess? Or what do you think would be a good offer to students? What would draw you in, or would have drawn you in? What would your thoughts be on that, Bethany or Shaunna, or have you seen any good practice, Laura?
I think for me, a big thing, sorry, Laura, is having the visibility of a neurodivergent person given these kind of talks. I respond better when it's someone who has shared experiences with me and is aware of the kind of array of difficulties that a neurodivergent person may experience throughout, every aspect of university, finances, whatever it may be. I do not respond well when it's particularly a neurotypical person trying to tell, from what they've read or whatever. So if there is that visibility of a neurodivergent person delivering, I think for me that would have helped my anxieties. But again, I've seen some conversations about no one size fits all, and that's totally correct. So, I'm very aware that this is my experience of what would help my anxiety, but it's very different for each individual. I think the best way is to have open conversations and ask people what would help them per se, and make adaptations on that.
Great, thank you, Bethany. Shaunna, you've got your hand up. Very, very kind of you to do that.
Yeah, so it just helps me know when it's my time.
No, I know.
It's
I'm just being very British, don't worry.
I constantly interrupt people when I'm on Zoom, because I never know when it's my time to talk. But if I'm honest, I would never attend a financial workshop, and that's being brutally honest. And the reason is I find it a really uncomfortable space to be in. And being care experienced, one thing that they do when you're exiting care is they go, oh, care experienced people have no financial literacy or skills. Let's put them into a workshop and have a budgeting sheet, and you do that loads when you're leaving care. Obviously each local authority is different, and there's a huge stigma around being care experienced and not being able to manage your finances. So I'm really put off in spaces like that. And I think what was actually quite helpful is I applied for the student support fund literally a few months ago, and I was able to have a conversation with a guy who runs a student support fund at the uni, what it's actually there for, and that it used to be called the Student Hardship Fund. So I never applied for it because I was like, I'm not in hardship, I've got a stipend. And then when he explained it's means tested just to make your money go further, I felt comfortable applying for that afterwards. And within it, there was a budgeting sheet which forced me to lay out my PhD stipend, which I honestly never done throughout my PhD. So I think little nuances into it like that, if you're applying for fund or extra money, maybe as part of it, some compulsory budgeting or quick courses or watch this video might help engagement a little bit more. And that's me just being brutally honest.
Well, I think the theme overall is, we know what we mean by workshop, and I mean we as universities know what we mean by workshop, but do students know what it means? And a quick video explainer or a quick, and a quick summary of the workshop posted out after might be useful, very succinct format. Laura, final comment, and then I'm just gonna wrap us up. But once you go, Laura, but there's some great chat and examples as ever in the Zoom for people to have a look at as well.
One piece of good practice that I have seen at a different university is an induction week prior to university begins for new starters. So in that induction week, they get introduced to university gradually, and it's primarily for students with neurodiversities. But in that week, they will have compulsory allotted sessions with the different teams. So they will meet somebody from the finance team, and they will sit down with them and have a one-to-one for 15-20 minutes just to talk about finances and what is available to that student and give them resources. That's something which has been really beneficial to students moving forward because they've already met the teams and they know who to go to.
Yeah, great stuff. And Bethany's put a really insightful thing in the chat around, yes, we put an email address out there for people to ask questions, but we've also touched on the thing about people feeling stigma keenly about, oh, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't really want to admit that by giving you my email address. But if there are anonymized functions through the web or that you can make a simple phone call if that's your style, to ask some of these trickier questions, that's a good practice as well. So I'm just going to say thanks so much to Laura, Shaunna, and Bethany. Made my job really easy, and it's been a pleasure to listen to you. I asked you and invited you here for a reason, because I thought you'd give what you've given, which is great. Thank you very much. Great insights. And Danielle, I'm just going to hand over to you to wrap up. But thanks everyone for your engagement and attention as well.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. I mean, I'm going to echo what you've said. Thank you to Laura, Bethany, and Shaunna for all of their time today, as well as thank you, Pete, for moderating that, kind of doing the questions and delivering a great session that I can see the things rolling in now to say thank you. Really great session, really useful, and thank you. And obviously, I don't know about you, but that hour just flew by, as it often does when we're kind of getting into these sorts of topics. So thank you very much for being a fabulous last session for 2023. Thank you to everybody else for joining us. In the chat, I saw that Rosie posted about the follow-up from this session. And that's it from us. I hope you have a wonderful break, and we'll see you all in 2024. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you soon.